What should we expect from Matt Milano, whoever wins the middle linebacker competition, and the Bills linebackers in 2023? There is plenty to get into, and I'm breaking that down today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino, author of Go Bills and Buffalo's Run, also the co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. I want to thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, and a big welcome and shout out to our everydayers. You know who you are. Those of you who never miss a single episode, I appreciate y'all being here very, very much. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Well, folks, it is time for a linebacker conversation, discussing all the dynamics of the position group entering training camp. And we've got some different stuff going on here at linebacker, and I'm excited to break it all down for you today on the podcast. We're going to attack this conversation like we have the previous positional group conversations, with a reflection on 2022, talking about the personnel changes and what does that tell us. Of course, my biggest questions now and in the future, and then my expectations for the unit in 2023. So let's get started, and let's first reflect on 2022, which was our fifth, final, and best year from the linebacker duo of Matt Milano and Tremaine Edmunds. We enjoyed watching these two players develop and grow together, be fixtures on a really good NFL defense. And now Tremaine Edmunds is gone. Tremaine Edmunds had his best season last year, and he parlayed that into a 4-year, $72 million deal with the Chicago Bears. And it leaves the Bills in a very interesting spot with a three-way competition for the starting Mike linebacker role in this defense, which we're going to break down a lot. But we're first reflecting on 2022. And, of course, it was the best season we saw from Edmunds and Milano together. Edmunds is gone. Matt Milano had a great season, 15 games, 15 starts, on the field for 96% of the defensive snaps, 99 tackles, 12 for loss, 1.5 sacks, 3 interceptions, 11 pass breakups, a 70.6 passer rating against his coverage. He was terrific. He had a great season, perhaps his best season yet in the NFL, and he did that all while battling a leg injury for a large part of the season. And he's a perfect player for what the Bills ask him to do, and that is to serve as a space and matchup linebacker. He's a big-time neutralizer against tight ends. In fact, the Bills were the only team in the NFL to not allow a touchdown to a tight end during the regular season. The Bills only allowed 616 yards to tight ends, which was the fourth fewest in the entire NFL. And that's all about Matt Milano. I remember the 1 year Matt Milano was injured for a good part of it, tried to play hurt. The Bills suddenly couldn't stop tight ends. I got all these questions about, why can't the Bills stop tight ends? And I'm trying to tell you, it's just that Matt Milano's not around, because when Matt Milano is on the field, historically, we got a big sample size. The Bills don't give up much to tight ends. Matt Milano's a terrific matchup linebacker, and he's one of the best in the game. His range, his instincts, they are outstanding. Now, I do have a gripe, a year-over-year gripe with Matt Milano that doesn't seem to go away. In fact, it's getting worse. It's missed tackles. Matt Milano misses too many tackles. It's something that I hope can improve, but it hasn't throughout his career. In fact, last year, his missed tackle rate was 16.7%, and his missed tackle rate for his career is 15.4%. So we are not exactly going in a good direction here, and I think that's just part of what you have to live with Matt Milano. But he certainly makes his share of plays to help make up for the plays he doesn't make because he misses tackles. Let's move on to Terrel Bernard, a rookie last year, third-round pick out of Baylor, was on the field for 16 games, only had one start. That was, of course, against the Jets. Wound up being on the field for 11% of the defensive snaps, 62% of the special team snaps. He was a four-phase player and actually was third on the Bills in special teams tackles last year. And I did an entire episode back in April considering Terrel Bernard and Tyrel Dodson and even Dorian Williams as candidates for the linebacker role. And I talked a lot about what I saw from that game tape against the Jets and saw a lot of inconsistency in a player that needs a lot of growth. And that's to be expected as a reserve third-round pick as a rookie. But obviously now he's a contender, perhaps even the leading contender, to be the starting middle linebacker. And so I don't know that we learned much about Terrel Bernard last year other than he's athletic, he can help you on special teams, but he's got a long way to go in terms of playing linebacker in the NFL, especially as a starter. You also had A.J. Klein last year, who was a midseason addition for the Bills. 6 games, 1 start. It's on the field for 22% of the defensive snaps, 52% of the special team snaps. Again, a four-phase player. And he was like a midseason addition. I know that A.J. Klein's been around, but he didn't start the year in Buffalo, but found his way to Buffalo. He actually started the Detroit game and had a role against the Bears. So, the Bills are very comfortable with him. They brought him back, and I think one of the messages that came from Sean McDermott about A.J. Klein being part of this mix is that he was going to be an asset for the room. And that makes sense. I mean, A.J. Klein goes way back in terms of his time with both Sean McDermott and linebackers coach Bobby Babich. I mean, a lot of mutual time together in Carolina. And for a position group that has a lot of young players in Dotson and Williams and Terrel Bernard and Balin Spector, a guy like A.J. Klein is beneficial for the room. I don't think he's a real candidate to start. Maybe he'll have a role. Maybe he won't make the team. We'll talk about that as we move along. But A.J. Klein came to the team midseason, started a game, had a role against the Bears, and was a factor on special teams. Tyler Matakevich only played 3 defensive snaps last year, but 80% of the special team snaps, 4 phases, one of the best special teams players in the entire NFL. He's just not going to help you on defense. He's a linebacker by title, but really a special teams player. You had Tyrel Dodson, who played in 16 games, started 3 on the field for 21% of snaps, 67% of special team snaps. So a guy that was your most utilized depth linebacker on defense, but also a guy that was on the field quite a bit for special teams. And he got those 2 starts against Pittsburgh and Cleveland. If you remember Pittsburgh and Cleveland games, the Bills did a great job of stopping the run against both Najee Harris and Nick Chubb. I mean, a phenomenal job against Nick Chubb, but the pass defense was a little bit sketchy. And I think that's where you really lose something with Tyrel Dodson, is that range and coverage ability in the middle of the field, but he's a good downhill player. And he's a guy that's been around since 2019. And so I think you learned last year that he's a sufficient backup, but not necessarily a guy I look at as a starting caliber player, although he very well could win the job. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. And then, of course, Balin Spector, who was a rookie last year, 7th-round pick out of Clemson. 2022, he was active for 6 games, played 12 snaps on defense and 86 snaps on special teams. He's very athletic. He was flashy in the preseason, but not a player that as a rookie got much opportunity. But to close out the conversation on reflecting on 2022, at the end of the day, this was the Milano and Edmunds show with a few spot starts sprinkled in from Dodson, Bernard, and Klein. And, the Bills were a good defense last year, and a big reason why was because of the impact that you got from both Tremaine Edmunds and Matt Milano. And with that in mind, it sets the stage very well for us to continue the conversation by focusing in on what's new with the personnel group and my biggest questions now and in the future. But first, I need to tell you about FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets win or lose. That's $200 that you can bet on everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think's going to hit the first home run. All on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. There's simply no better place to bet MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. So let's talk about what's new and what does that tell us about the direction of the position group. Well, in 2022, we just went through the cast of characters, and every player from 2022 returns except Tremaine Edmunds, who is now a Chicago Bear. And your additions of note were a third-round pick on Tulane linebacker Dorian Williams, and then you brought in a veteran reserve-type player in Traven Howard. So everyone's back, minus Tremaine Edmunds, plus Dorian Williams and Traven Howard. So what does this tell us about the direction of the position group? Well, number one, I think very clearly, the Bills aren't as concerned with replacing Tremaine Edmunds as I am. And this was a big talking point that I had leading up to free agency, during free agency, leading up to the draft. Just no real move to give you much as a replacement for Tremaine Edmunds. And on one hand, I get concerned about that. But on the other hand, I'm aware of the Bills being aware of what they have and rolling with it. And does that mean the Bills are right? Can you simply look at it and say, well, the Bills are the ones that have everything to lose based on what they have available at linebacker, and they seem to be comfortable with the options, so you should too. No, there's a chance the Bills are wrong and they had a big miscalculation here at linebacker. But there's also a chance that they're right. And accepting what they have as the group to compete to replace Tremaine Edmunds says something about their level of confidence in one of Bernard, Dodson, or Williams to be the replacement. There's a level of comfort. The Bills are aware of the expectations. Sean McDermott is taking over as the defensive play caller, putting his full stamp on this defense, calling the plays, coordinating the unit. And he's doing so knowing that this is what he has at linebacker. So the first thing that I acknowledge is that the Bills just aren't as concerned with replacing Tremaine Edmunds as I am. Number two, and I think this is probably the most important thing because we've heard very specific messaging from key people within the organization, is that the Bills wanted a different style of player next to Matt Milano. Now, before I get into this, I will acknowledge that these comments came out after they lost Tremaine Edmunds. And so when you lose a unicorn-type player with a very unique skill set that can just do a lot of different things, of course there's going to be an acceptance that you just don't have that skill set, and also the willingness to lean into something different because you had to. And I don't know that it's as simple as, well, Tremaine Edmunds had a great season and he priced himself out of the Bills' price range and took the money and went to Chicago. I think that the Bills probably were optimistic throughout that they can get Tremaine back and then didn't. So they wanted a different style of player next to Milano. I want to point to two comments here that are very significant. The first from Bobby Babich, the Bills linebackers coach, and then Brandon Beane. Now, Bobby Babich is a coach that we should probably be more aware of than we are. He started his NFL career in 2011 in Carolina, which is exactly when Sean McDermott was there as a defensive coordinator. And he was like an assistant to the coaching staff and then a defensive assistant. And he was there for a number of years with Sean McDermott. Then he left and went to Cleveland for like a year or two. And then he reunited with Sean McDermott again. He spent a lot of time with Sean McDermott. And so you kind of feel like Bobby Babich in some way is his young protege in terms of coaching. And, his dad, Bob Babich, was a long tenured coach in the NFL, but Bobby Babich is like a young defensive mind out there. And he was part of the coaching that helped Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer become what they are today. And you've heard Poyer and Hyde really speak highly of Bobby Babich. And then Bobby Babich went from safeties coach to linebackers coach last year, and you saw Edmunds and Milano play their best football. And so a big part of my, I don't know what the word is, my hope, my optimism for the Bills linebackers and even the direction of the defensive coaching staff is the existence of Bobby Babich as a young, innovative mind that's got a pretty impressive track record that I don't think a lot of people are talking about. But Bobby Babich met with the media during OTAs, and he was asked about the linebacker situation, and he said the way that the NFL game is going, it's ideal for teams to have two matchup linebackers. And he continued and said, Dorian Williams is a matchup type linebacker with intelligence and physicality that they're looking for. And so part of the dilemma that I've had internally processing the moves that the Bills have and haven't made at linebacker with the drafting of Terrel Bernard and Dorian Williams and the style of players that they are is my initial reaction to both draft picks was that these guys seem more like Matt Milano replacements than Tremaine Edmunds replacements. And when you don't have this intel, and I'll further expand into this when I share some comments from Brandon Beane, you're like, well, that's not even close to a one-for-one skill set. It doesn't project to doing what they asked Tremaine Edmunds to do. And so it's hard to reconcile and say, well, I mean, how many Matt Milano type players can you have? Well, in all actuality, based on this messaging, that's exactly what they wanted. They wanted two matchup linebackers to play alongside each other on the second level of the defense and not necessarily have your bigger bodied guy that can play downhill into the line of scrimmage. And look, I'm keenly aware of what it takes to play Mike linebacker in the NFL. And it's not just being Ray Lewis or Levon Kirkland or Jeremiah Trotter or those big downhill, burly, thumping linebackers. I don't need that, but I need some of that to go with primarily an ability to play in space and have range and be able to cover. You have to do a lot more in today's NFL at linebacker. And the Bills are leaning into having two matchup linebackers, which is going to be the case seemingly in 2023 and perhaps beyond. But you hear those comments from Bobby Babich, and then you hear what Brandon Beane said on Chris Long's podcast about losing Tremaine Edmunds and replacing him. And this is what Brandon Beane said. He said, the game is trending more and more to pass first. Teams are passing in situations they never used to. It's a matchup game. When you're going to play the Chiefs or the Bengals, they are going to get you in tough matchups. Tremaine is a really good player, but there were some matchup issues. He's 6'5". It's hard. You put a little slot on him, and it's not fair to him. He's just a little more gangly. So finding the right player that's firm enough against the run, can get off blocks, but can still match up with these pass-heavy teams. Says a lot. So you definitely have a big transition here in terms of the style of player that's going to be playing next to Matt Milano as the Mike linebacker. And how this all goes is really interesting to me. I think you can make a case that at 6'5", 250, Tremaine Edmunds wasn't exactly a great downhill player. And so maybe you've gotten about the same as at downhill ability. You don't necessarily have the length in range as in terms of coverage, but you do have more ability to match steps and play man coverage at linebacker and move away from some of the zone at middle linebacker. So there's going to be some transition here, but it seems like perhaps that transition is exactly what the Buffalo Bills want. All right, so in the last segment here, we got a lot to get into. My biggest questions now and in the future, and my expectations for the Bills linebackers in 2023 are all coming up after a very, very quick break. All right, a jam-packed final segment for you here today. Let's get into my biggest questions now and in the future for the Bills linebackers. And, of course, the question is who's starting at middle linebacker? Who's it going to be? I think you got three real candidates here: Tyrel Dodson, Terrel Bernard, and Dorian Williams. And I could probably talk myself into any one of these three as the player I would predict wins the job. And so instead of telling you who I think's going to win, I'll talk about the dynamics of each player. First of all, Tyrel Dodson. I mean, what Tyrel Dodson has going for him is that he's been in the mix since 2019. And the Bills have been committed to Tyrel Dodson, even as an undrafted free agent rookie that had some off-the-field issues. They stuck with him through that. And then, re-signed him and kept him around. There's familiarity there. And we know that the Bills are a team that will often lean into familiarity over other options, sometimes younger players. And so probably the biggest thing that Tyrel Dodson has going for him over Terrel Bernard and Dorian Williams is simply that he's been around since 2019. And because of that, there's probably a level of comfort that exists with him. And that might be enough to get him the job. Like if everything's close between Dodson, Bernard, and Williams, and you have to make your concessions regardless of whoever the player is, perhaps the Bills just say, you know what? We think it's close. This guy's been around the longest. We're rolling with Tyrel Dodson. I think that's probably the best case that Tyrel Dodson has. He might be the best downhill player of any of these three. He also might be the worst coverage player of any of these three. All right, the other players are Terrel Bernard and Dorian Williams. For Terrel Bernard, second-year player that got a chance to start one game last year, has been around, right? That's helpful. That's something that he has over Dorian Williams, is that while he doesn't have experience dating back to 2019, he does have 1 year of experience going into his second season. He's also the first player that the Bills drafted in the third round with the idea of having to replace either Milano or Edmunds. And we've heard Sean McDermott speak about his relationship with Dave Aranda, who was Terrel Bernard's coach at Baylor, and feeling like there's good intel there about who he is and perhaps a big reason why they drafted him as high as they did. So we'll see here. I feel like Bernard may have a real shot at winning this. In fact, he may be the favorite. But he's a player that when I studied him at Baylor, when I studied him with the Jets, I certainly came away with plenty of questions. And then lastly, Dorian Williams. He's a rookie, but what I think Dorian Williams has going for him in terms of his big argument is that he has the best size and athleticism combination of any of the candidates. And he also has the best college resume. Very accomplished player at Tulane. And so you have size, athleticism, a good resume going into the NFL. And maybe you feel like with the defensive line that you have playing next to Matt Milano that you roll the dice and kind of see what you have in terms of what could be your highest upside player. Even with Terrel Bernard, there's been injury issues throughout his career in college. So I'm curious to see how it plays out. I think that's probably the leading case for each one of those guys to win the job. But I think what I come away concerned with is that I don't necessarily love any one of these options. So if you point to like the cornerback 2 competition or the right guard competition, I'm like, okay, yeah, you got some legit contenders here that you might even have more than one guy here that's worthy of starting. I don't look at any one of these three players and feel overly confident that, hey, you got at least one legitimate starter here. And so I just feel like we have so much to learn about all three of these players. And hopefully the Bills make the right decision and make it fast. And I'll talk about that in just a moment, why that's so important. But the Bills need to be right about rolling the dice with these three options and one of them being a legitimate answer. Number 2, in terms of my biggest questions now and in the future, is how does the middle linebacker situation impact Matt Milano? Because the last thing that you want to do is take away from what you get from Matt Milano because you're playing a guy that's uncomfortable next to him. And I think part of the reason why the Bills didn't just say, okay, Matt Milano, you're going to be the mic, you're getting the green dot, you're calling the defense, is because they're really happy with what Matt Milano gives them. And so the last thing you want to do is make Matt Milano a lesser player and then put a lesser player replacing Matt Milano. You don't want to get worse in 2 spots to try to get by at 1. So how does this all impact Matt Milano? I don't have an answer for you, but there could be an impact. Number 3 is Tyler Medikevich. What does his role look like beyond this year? When you consider both a void year next year for Tyler Medikevich, the Bills are paying him $667,000 regardless. Is he a player that comes back? He's been a team captain, big-time special teams impact. But is his impact on special teams reduced if the NFL maintains this one-year trial kickoff rule where a fair catch gets you the ball at the 25, even if it's fielded outside of the end zone? If that sticks, is there less of a impact for the kick and kick return and Medikevich becomes a little less valuable? I'm interested to see what happens with Medikevich. They love him. This guy doesn't even get a jersey during preseason games because they know the role that he's going to fill. Tyler Medikevich plays less in preseason than Josh Allen. Says something, right, about who they think he is and how important he is. So what's the future there? Number 4 is Balen Spector's role and trajectory. I think lost in this entire conversation about Bernard and Williams and Dotson is this 7th-round pick that could be an impact special teamer, could be a sleeper, right? I mean, Sean McDermott's had some history here with unlocking late-round linebackers. You think of A.J. Klein as an example of that. What do you have in Balen Spector, and does this competition really take away from his development? I'm interested to find out. And then lastly, just who makes the roster? The Bills typically keep 6 linebackers. And so I think you have 5 players that I would expect to be on this roster barring injury. And that's, of course, Matt Milano, Terrel Bernard, Dorian Williams, Tyrel Dodson, and Tyler Medikevich. That's 5. So then you have 1 spot for Balen Spector, A.J. Klein, and Traven Howard. I think Traven Howard's the least likely of those 3, but A.J. Klein as an asset to the room, and Balen Spector as a young, athletic linebacker that, you can maintain control at a low cost for a number of years that at a minimum can play special teams for you. I'm not sure you're going to be eager to move on. So it might come down to who you feel best about getting back on the practice squad, and I'm not sure teams are going to be lining up to get A.J. Klein. So is A.J. Klein just still around as a practice squad player and you roster Balen Spector? Does Traven Howard make enough noise to rock the boat here with this conversation? It's all stuff to be mindful of when you consider the top questions for the Bills linebackers entering 2023. So what are my expectations for the unit? I've got 3 expectations written down. Number 1 is be right about your choice at middle linebacker and don't let it linger. You made an aggressive choice, in my opinion, to roll with this trio of candidates to compete for replacing Edmunds. And I know the Bills were at least rumored to have some interest in some of the veterans out there, like Bobby Wagner, if I'm not mistaken, Levante David. There was some rumblings out there that they reached out to him. But at the end of the day, they didn't do it, right? They didn't close on any of these players and are rolling with what they have. They need to be right about that. They need to be right about that, and they can't let this decision linger. And the reason why I say it can't linger, obviously you got to let the competition play out. You have to, right? But you want to get to the point where you're comfortable with your decision as soon as possible because as you've heard from McDermott and Bean and Bobby Babich and even Micah Hyde, the biggest job of this middle linebacker is to communicate and make sure that the defense is all on the same page. And the way that you get good at that is reps. And if you're splitting reps 3 ways, that really takes away from any one guy's ability to command a large volume, get comfortable, and take command. And so I'm hopeful that this competition plays out, but that it gets to a resolution pretty quick. And now look, there's a good chance that the Bills don't really tell us who wins the job, and then we just find out week 1 against the Jets, just like we did with, who was going to start at corner between Benford and Elam last year. We found out whenever the Bills took the field against the Rams. And so I'm sure this will be a regular question for Sean McDermott in press conferences, and I'm sure he's going to avoid answering it for as long as possible. So while we may not know, the team needs to know, and they need to get that player repped as much as possible entering the season. Number 2, in terms of my expectations for the unit, is I want a sustained high-level impact from Matt Milano. I don't want to see any drop-off. You extended Matt Milano through 2026. He's a fixture for this organization, has been a fixture for this organization, and you need him to be healthy and impactful like he's been. Number 3, and the last thing I have written down, is get strong special teams contributions from the depth. You've got a lot of guys here. Like, only one's going to win the job between Bernard, Williams, and Dodson. That means the other 2 are going to be important special teams player. And in the case of Dodson and Bernard, they have time doing that, right? I just mentioned Bernard was 3rd on the team in special teams tackles last year. Dodson's been a multi-phase special teams player for a number of seasons. And so between those 2, plus Tyler Medikevich, who exists only for special teams, Balin Spector, you should have some good impact from your depth in the special teams department. So there you have it. My big thought dump for the Bills linebackers entering 2023. Obviously, I have some nervousness about whoever's starting at middle linebacker, but I acknowledge that this is the path that the Bills in some ways have chosen, and they need to be right about it. And I'll be fascinated to watch this competition play out. And it's going to be a big talking point until it doesn't have to be, right? Till one of these guys shows up, plays well, does it for a number of games. This is going to be at the forefront of my mind. All right, folks, tomorrow on the podcast, herd mentality. Then the rest of the week, we get to cornerbacks and safeties. And then the following week, the Bills report for training camp. So a lot coming up here on Locked On Bills. Don't miss anything. Make sure that you are subscribed. Would love it if you took a second to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day. Go Bills. And I look forward to catching up with you again tomorrow.